Well, here in Canberra today, the Prime Minister outlined his second-term agenda at the National Press Club. There's been much debate since Labor's landslide election win about whether it should use this moment to do something big and embark on major economic reforms. Anthony Albanese has been careful to temper such expectations, but today announced plans for a roundtable discussion in August where new ideas to boost growth and productivity will be discussed.
We want to have open and honest conversations, not shut down conversations by saying if someone raises an issue, that means you immediately go from A to Z, which is often what happens.
The ABC's National Affairs correspondent Jane Norman was at the speech today and joined me a short time ago. Now, Jane, a productivity roundtable may not sound like a barrel of laughs, and it might in fact be a bit of an oxymoron. But anyway, could this be the opening to some bolder reform in the second term of the Albanese government?
Look, I think the Prime Minister is very cautious not to build up expectations, but this is something. We know that stagnant productivity has been a huge issue for our economy. It's been stagnant or falling for years, and ask any economist and they'll tell you that for the past few decades, it's productivity improvements that have led to wage increases, which ultimately lead to boosting living standards. So that's at the heart of all of this. How do we boost living standards in Australia through productivity gains? Well, that question will be answered, we hope, or the government hopes, at a roundtable that they're convening in August with unions, business and industry groups. They're trying to find some common ground, some areas for improvement that will ultimately lead to productivity gains. It's
not easy finding common ground amongst those various groups you mentioned, and I guess that brings us to the big question since the election of how far Anthony Albanese and Labor are prepared to go with this huge majority that they've won. Will they do something big, or will they stick with a more cautious approach? What signals did the Prime Minister give on this today?
Yeah, well, he put two changes on the table that he wants to see. He sees approvals processes as one area of improvement, particularly when it comes to removing roadblocks to housing supply and the clean energy transition. We know that there is an enormous pipeline of investment when it comes to new wind and solar farms, but really slow approvals processes at both the state and the federal level means that we risk missing the target of hitting 82% renewables by 2030. So that's what the Prime Minister wants to see. What he doesn't want to see is any kind of proposal that seeks to wind back workers' entitlements, penalty rates and wages. So they're the kind of guardrails he's putting around it. From the business perspective, I think it's fair to say there's a bit of scepticism because the last time we saw something like this was the Jobs and Skills Summit at the start of the Albanese government's first term. Business leaders feel quite burned by that process to some extent because they believe it sort of ushered in or was the starting point for pretty big industrial relations changes that they weren't expecting that ultimately were ushered through in the Albanese government's first term. But they will be taking a seat at this table. Their ambitions are a bit greater. They want tax reform, they want regulations to be wound back, and they certainly want, private investment to be sort of spurred again so that it's the private sector, not just the government, that is growing jobs. So the PM reckons there are some win-wins. We'll see in that kind of bucket of ideas where those win-wins are.
And then the Prime Minister at the end of this week, Jane, heads off to Canada where the G7 summit is happening. He's expected to meet Donald Trump on the sidelines of that summit. You'll be there as well. Look, we know the Trump administration wants Australia to spend more on defence, a considerable increase in defence. What's the Prime Minister saying about that today?
Look, I don't think that the Prime Minister will go to the G7 with any kind of concrete commitment to present to Donald Trump. I think politically there's not much in it for him. Practically, he's really pushed back on this idea of setting what he calls arbitrary targets for defence spending. He says that doesn't exist in any other portfolio in the budget, so why would he apply it to defence? But I think it's fair to say that there is international pressure, or at least a trend in that direction, to accelerate spending. Australia is on track to hit defence spending of 2.3% of GDP by 2033. Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary, wants that to be 3.5%, which is about what the Americans spend. It's a huge lift, would mean tens of billions more. But you look at some other kind of comparable Western countries. In the UK, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister there, has accelerated his spending. So the UK will hit 2.5% of its GDP by 2027. So you see that there is a trend emerging for other countries, and it's unclear how long the government can sort of hold the line for. But certainly today, Anthony Albanese said that he'd be open to increasing spending if there was a capability requirement.
Yeah, I thought it was notable that he's open to going further on defence spending. I don't think he wants to be seen to be doing it because Donald Trump is asking him to do it, though. I think that's very clear. Look, finally, Jane, the situation in LA. We've seen those concerning scenes over the last few days there. Anthony Albanese, careful not to directly criticise Donald Trump, but he did make some, well, pretty sharp criticism of the wounding of an Australian journalist covering those protests yesterday.
Yeah, and our audience might have seen the pretty disturbing video footage of Nine journalist Lauren Tomasi getting hit in the leg by a projectile that was shot by one of the riot police. Today, the Prime Minister was asked about that, and his response was very strong. Firstly, the Forum. He was asked at the National Press Club, the kind of premier institution for national debate, and he said that he'd spoken to Lauren Tomasi this morning, so he's taking a very personal interest in this case, but he described the incident as horrific, unacceptable, an Australian journalist clearly identified as a member of the media being targeted in this way. Now, he revealed Australia has raised this with the US administration. He didn't sort of reveal at what level that is. He wouldn't say whether he would personally raise it with Donald Trump, but certainly very strong comments to make at a forum like the Press Club, defending press freedom and the ability of journalists to do their jobs.
And as you say, using the weight of his office as Prime Minister to express those concerns, that message won't be missed in the United States, you would think. Jane Norman, thank you.
Thank you.